Hello, History Geeks. It's me, Miss Tarot, back for another episode of Period 8, our voyage through U.S. history. Today, we are going to be talking about economic programs that came about after World War II, as well as looking into the civil rights movement. We could spend a whole semester talking about the civil rights movement. Obviously, we don't have time to do that in the next 2 weeks. So we're going to have to deal with the little time that we have. And also, but I will also be showing a documentary, maybe before the test, about the civil rights movement. So, economic program and civil rights. The Employment Act of 1946 was passed by essentially Truman, encouraged Congress to enact a series of progressive measures looking at national health insurance, increased in minimum wage, and a bill to commit the U.S. government to maintaining full employment for its employees. Also set up the Council of Economic Advisors, which essentially counsel both the President and Congress on means of promoting national economic welfare. Essentially, this was a plan to kind of get people out, people that worked in government kind of out into communities to see what living really meant and how it was working and what wasn't working and what were the basic things that people needed in order to be successful and feed their families and so on and so forth. Truman is considered the first modern president to use the powers of office to challenge racial discrimination. He established the Committee on Civil Rights in 1946. He also strengthened the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department. In 1948, he ordered the end of racial discrimination throughout the federal government, meaning that Black people could now have jobs in the federal government and they would also be paid equally. In 1951, the 22nd Amendment was passed, which limited a president to a maximum of 2 full terms in office. A Republican-dominated Congress proposal. And in 1946, voters were in a more conservative mood, and the Republicans took over the Congress. And in doing so, they were able to roll back some of the New Deal gains for labor, and of course, make tax cuts for the wealthy. The Taft-Hartley Act in 1947 also happens during this time period, which would help to check the power of unions. They outlawed the closed shop. They permitted states to pass the right to work laws, which outlawing the union shop. They outlawed secondary boycotts. And lastly, gave the president the power to invoke an 80-day cooling off period. So kind of a big deal for big business and as well as unions. Now we're going to transition into something super important during this time period, and that would be the origins of the Cold War. This is something that's really going to dominate international relationships from the late 40s, really until the early 1990s. And obviously it has to do with us, the United States, and our relationship with communist countries, particularly the Soviet Union. Like it says here, it's centered around the intense rivalry between 2 superpowers, the Communist Empire of the Soviet Union and, of course, the United States of America. So let's start with U.S. and Soviet relations in 1945. During World War II, the United States and Russia actually had a good thing going. They had a pretty good relationship. Russia of the Soviet Union was a little bit still had a bad taste in their mouth from what Hitler did to them. The Bolshevik Revolution, which happens in 1917, Americans had viewed the Soviets as a threat to capitalistic countries. Here in the United States, we experienced something called the Red Scare in 1919, in which we are pretty petrified of communism and the spread of communism and the threat to our democracy and so on and so forth. I really look like a hot mess. Sorry, I just got back from the gym. In 1945, the United Nations was formed, and the 5 allied countries of the war were given permanent seats in the United Nations, and also were given veto power in the Security Council. And those nations were the United States, Great Britain, France, China, and of course the Soviet Union. Also, the UN established the Atomic Energy Commission in the UN. The Soviet Union rejected, however, a plan proposed for regulating nuclear energy and eliminating atomic weapons. And this, of course, makes the United States and these other nations a little bit worried about maybe what the Soviet Union's priorities are. What are they doing with atomic weapons? What are they doing with nuclear energy? Do we need to be worried about that? So on and so forth. And of course, the United Nations also helps to set up the World Bank. In 1946, Soviet forces remained in occupation of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. From 46 to 48, communist dictators, most of them loyal to Moscow, obviously came to power in places like Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. And all of these essentially become satellite states of the Soviet Union. This really worries the United States because they don't really particularly care for the expansion of communism, and they're worried about what that means for their relationships as well as safety issues. So, going back a little bit to what happened at the end of World War II, we're still seeing occupation zones in Germany as a result of the end of World War II. So, at the end of the war, the division of Germany and Austria by the French, the US, and British were supposed to be temporary. Okay, sorry, I had to pause for a moment. But so at the end of the war, the division of Germany and Austria by the French, US, British, and the US was supposed to essentially only be temporary. However, in the Eastern Zone, which was under Soviet control, eventually this becomes a new communist state known as the German Democratic Republic. So this is essentially when we see the Iron Curtain, or this Soviet communist kind of regime, slowly start to descend, as Winston Churchill says, across the continent. So the Iron Curtain, Truman is really getting nervous and annoyed by the Soviets, wondering, what their plan is, what their end game is. The Red Scare, again, which we've already had experience once in the United States in 1919, early 1920s, is kind of making a return. The threat of communism, the Red Scare, the threat of communism, something that was very much on the radar of Americans and the government. And of course, like I said, Winston Churchill comes out with his famous quote, "An Iron Curtain has descended across the continent of Europe." What does this mean for Europe, for politics, for relationships? What are the Soviets after? What does that do to democratic governments? What kind of countries are going to fall to communism and why? Lots of questions out there and lots of people worried about it. Churchill calls for a partnership between Western democracies to help halt the expansion of communism. The big question has always been by historians, did this speech anticipate the Cold War, or does it help to cause it? So what does the United States do in this case? Well, we decide that we are going to stick to or maintain what we call a policy of containment. So we are looking at containment in Europe. And when we contain something, we keep it, try to keep it to the space that it's in already. We don't want to get it bigger. We don't want it expanding. We want it to stay where it is and not grow. So the U.S. policy on communism under Harry S. Truman is containment. Basically this was formulated by Secretary of State General George Marshall, Under Secretary of State at the time Dean Acheson, and George F. Kennan, who fancied himself an expert on Soviet affairs. And here's a great quote: only a long-term Patient but firm and vigilant, containment of Russia's expansive tendencies would eventually cause the Soviets to back off their communist ideologies or world domination and live in peace with other nations. So, what's the Truman Doctrine all about? Harry S. Truman, first implemented the containment policy in response to two major threats that came about. One was a communist-led uprising against the government in Greece, and two were Soviet demands for some controls of a water route in Turkey and Dardanelles. Truman turns and asks Congress in March of 1947 for $400 million in economic and military aid to assist the free people of Greece, meaning the people not under communist control, still living in a democracy, and hopefully still wanting to maintain a democracy. So he wanted $400 million to aid these people in Greece and Turkey against these totalitarian regimes. Once he asked Congress, it kind of came across, some people were adamant about, yes, we need to send this help. Some people were like, nah, not so much. So it did get bipartisan support, however. So that means both Democrats and Republicans were interested in helping Truman with his cause. So next they come up with the Marshall Plan. The years after World War II were really tough for people of Europe, right? So remember, keep in mind, like after World War I, their countries are totally destroyed by the war. And as discontent grows, okay, this is how the communism and the growth of the Communist Party is going to seep in. If you're unhappy with your country, if you're unhappy with your government, if you're not making a living, if nobody's helping you, this is how regimes, like the communist regime, kind of sneak their way in because they promise people that they can help. Whether they're really helping or not is up for debate. But if your country is vulnerable, if your government is not strong and centralized, has the potential for communism to sneak in. So as discontent is growing, it encouraged the growth of the Communist Party, especially in Italy and in France. So Truman and the United States fear that the Western democracies might vote the communists into power. So Marshall, at the time, outlines a plan in 1947, which essentially is a program of U.S. economic aid to help European nations revive their economies and strengthen Western democracies. This is kind of two-folded on our behalf to keep communism out and help these countries and let these countries know that we're here for them and that we're not going to allow communism to come in. Truman submitted a $17 billion European recovery program, which obviously becomes known as the Marshall Plan. In 48, $12 billion in aid was approved for distribution to the countries of Western Europe, which would be done over a 4-year period. Excuse me. It offered the Soviets and they offered it to the Soviets and the satellites, but obviously they refused. The plan worked just as Truman had hoped. The U.S. money helped Western Europe achieve self-sustaining growth by the 1950s, and therefore the threat of communism was minimized. Increased U.S. Also as a result, there were increased U.S. Exports to Europe. And however, the downside is that this does deepen a rift and animosities between the United States and the Soviets, obviously. Okay, we're going to look at the Berlin airlift. This is another kind of rift-causing situation between the Soviets and the U.S., but in June of 1948, the Soviets cut off all access by land to the German city of Berlin. Truman did not want to use force to get through. Instead, he ordered the U.S. Planes to fly in supplies to the people of West Berlin. Day after day, month after month, the airlift continued. Truman also sends about 60 bombers to England, which had the ability to carry atomic bombs if necessary. In the end, Stalin rather smartly decides not to challenge the airlift. By 1949, the Soviets finally opened the highways to Berlin, and this essentially creates two Germanys, Federal Republic of Germany and the German Democratic